Very good morning to everybody. Gives me great pleasure to be here at ORF. Thanks to Sushant for this Afghanistan at yet another roundabout. I love the name, at yet another roundabout. The session on continuing uncertainties. To use that old cliche, if there is something certain right now for a long time, it is the uncertainty of Afghanistan. So many false turns we have come to and crossed, and things don't seem to really improve in the sense. The level of casualties has been going up. Though on a percentage basis, this first 6 months of this year has been slightly lower than last year's, if I take the comparative figures, but that's no good news. The sheer numbers is horrific. A lot of people had expectations on this the ongoing dialogue between the US and the Taliban. A lot of people are upset with the dialogue at the same time. So there was two very strong strands growing through. One pinning their hopes on the dialogue, and the other feeling that it's serving no purpose, that the legitimate government should be there, right? The realities of the world are quite different. The fact that cell phones need to be switched off, that's a fact of life. The other fact of life is that whether we like it or not, the Taliban are a major source of strength, of power. The power to inflict violence remains the strongest trump card. And therefore, countries, Russia, China, Iran, not just Pakistan, have been pressing as the Taliban as a very legitimate interlocutor. And the USA wanted to take its troops out. You had no option because the road to peace in Kabul goes through Rawalpindi. And Taliban and Rawalpindi obviously are in very close contact, much more than that actually, but that's then be left unsaid. With the security situation being what it is, the Afghan forces able to counter the Taliban at a number of places, but not really able to turn the tide. So while the Taliban may not have physically taken Kunduz or Ghazni for any length of time, the fact is that they have not been marginalized at all, in fact, far from it. If out of 400 odd districts, 260 districts are either in their control or affected by them in a very strong way, where normal life in terms of governance is not possible, then obviously things are. And therefore, the question raised is here, would reconciliation on Taliban terms be better than no reconciliation at all? And is peace a realistic possibility in Afghanistan? We have four very distinguished speakers. Ambassador Rakesh Sood, as it says, a distinguished fellow at the Observer Research Foundation, and of course a former ambassador of India to Afghanistan. So Rakesh, could you start the ball rolling? Each of us, I think each of the four should speak for about, 12, 14 minutes, so that we leave about half an hour at the end. Less even. I'm happy with 10, but then when people come well prepared, then it feels a little awkward to tell them, okay, now can you stop it? So over to you, Rakesh.
Thank you, Shakti. And let me first of all welcome everybody here for the session on Afghanistan. You know, there are a lot of myths that get created, and very often myths become larger than reality. And one of these myths about Afghanistan is the graveyard of empires. I mean, according to me, it is a serious myth, because it is not as if Afghanistan has not known periods of stability, or even when the first round, when Afghanistan had 3 wars with British India, at that time also it was not as if Afghanistan defeated British Indian forces. It was always, in a sense, a stalemate. And in a sense, there was a political agent that got appointed. So Afghanistan's sovereignty was always restricted in that sense. So it was not as if it was a graveyard of empires, it was just that it was a borderland, it was a frontier region which became a battleground for competitive politics of external powers. At that time, the British Indian Empire and the Tsarist Russian Empire and the Persian Empire. Subsequently, it was with the Soviet invasion in 1979, it became a battleground for USA CIA-led covert war from 79 to 89. And then, of course, post-2001, we've seen yet another cycle of uncertainty. So, but in the middle, there have been periods. I mean, if you look at the 30, 40 years from 1930s till 1973, when the first coup took place, you actually had a period of enormous stability when the rest of the world was going through a lot of instability. You had the Great Depression of the late 1920s, you had the rise of fascism in Europe, you had World War II and all the rest of it, but through this period, Afghanistan continued to have a stable government. So it is not as if Afghanistan has not known periods of stability, but yes, when there have been external influences which have used the Afghan territory as a frontier area to settle their own political battles with whosoever it may be, then Afghanistan does get into a cycle of instability. But nonetheless, the myth has grown, and the Taliban certainly seem to believe, and they keep saying this, that Afghanistan is the graveyard of empires. So you talk of the British Empire, then you talk of the Soviet Empire, and now, after 18 years, they say that the American occupation, because that's what it has been called as, is going to be ended. Now, so this last cycle, let's say the post-2001, post-9/11 cycle, if we just look at that as an entity, because this involves the US, this is a little different from, let's say, the other cycles. Why is it different? Because I think the US intervention in Afghanistan post-9/11 was actually an intervention that was strongly supported by the entire international community. You know, it wasn't really, when the US went in, they went in with a lot of global support. The United Nations Security Council was unanimous in supporting, except for one country which had reservations, and that was Pakistan. Pakistan had to be brought in to cooperate. General Musharraf had to be brought in to cooperate. He was somewhat reluctant, shall we say, and the Americans had to use a fair amount of pressure to get Pakistan to cooperate. But nonetheless, apart from that, even in Afghanistan, the entry of the Americans in 2002, 2003 was pretty much welcomed. The security environment in Kabul in 2002, 2003 was fairly peaceful. We didn't see this. But then, very quickly, I think there were a series of mistakes, and that is where the tragedy of the current set of uncertainty, which brings us to the new roundabout, comes in. And this is as a result of cumulated series of errors made by a number of people, and I think most prominently the United States, for the simple reason that the US had by far the largest footprint, by far the largest military presence, and by far the largest economic presence also in the country. One of the first things that was done was the US put in a constitution which was modeled very much on the US Constitution. So it was a highly centralized system of government, power vested in a president. But unlike in the US, where you have had an evolution of a system of checks and balances through the Congress and the Senate and the judiciary and civil society and media and so on, in Afghanistan, you didn't have all of these institutions. I mean, these institutions were built literally from scratch. So, but nonetheless, you had created an institution, elections, and all the rest of it. The second major US error, as it were, and the US realized this much later, because in 2014, the US itself backed the idea of a national unity government, where they said, well, we will have a post of a CEO, which was supposed to be converted into the post of a prime minister, which would have created greater balance and a kind of, brought about a greater distribution of power, as it were, rather than centralizing it in the form of one single authority, namely the president and the president's office, which is as it is in the United States, as we can see. And even there, after all these centuries of evolution, it has created difficulties in the US. So for Afghanistan to have taken this system, created such a centralized system of power in the office of the president, was something which was extremely difficult without corresponding checks and balances. Then, of course, in 2003, you had the Iraq war, and that was a huge distraction. By this time, when the Taliban had started to regroup and re-emerge by 2005, 6, etc., the US was sufficiently distracted with Iraq. And instead of acknowledging that, yes, there was an issue here, it was easier for the US to kind of push it under the table and engage in a combination of carrot and stick policy with Pakistan, sort of deny the fact that Taliban had safe havens there for the beginning, for at least in 2005, 6, 7, push Pakistan privately, and meanwhile keep rewarding them and, holding out the carrot that if you cooperate with us, then you will get a certain amount of financial, military, etc., support, which over a period of 16, 17 years had worked out to something like $31, $32 billion. Pakistanis have played this game beautifully. They played it during the 80s. They played it again. So in a sense, I think if there is one country that knows how to manipulate the US system, that is certainly Pakistan. And they demonstrated that very effectively. Later on, by the time the Bush administration ended and people realized that the Obama administration came in, now they could take a fresh look. I think there was a growing criticism of Pakistan, but then Obama announced his surge and simultaneously announced his date of withdrawal. Which was any military strategist will tell you that this is absolutely a suicidal way of going about dealing with growing insurgency. And fast forward to Trump, and by this time, of course, there were all kinds of, there was a growing general consensus, at least in the West, because the fatigue factor had set in, that we were now at a situation where Taliban had been re-evaluated. Instead of being called an insurgency, instead of being called a terrorist organization, as was perhaps the case in the past, now the Taliban were seen as legitimate political actors who had to be brought around the negotiating table. And, so various major countries got into the act, whether it was Russia, whether it was China, Pakistan certainly. For Pakistan, it had been a long-term objective to ensure that the Taliban gained this legitimacy. And I think this is the key change that has taken place this time around, because unlike the 1990s, when the Taliban had come to power, the Taliban regime was recognized only by 3 countries, by Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. So in a sense, it didn't enjoy that legitimacy. But today, if you look at it, the Taliban delegations are being welcomed across the world. Whether in European capitals, whether in Moscow, whether in Beijing, whether in Jakarta, whether in Doha, etc., they have an office and so on. So in a sense, there is a greater sense of legitimacy, as it were. And this was essentially the Pakistani objective, that to ensure that the Taliban, when they come back seen as a legitimate political actor. And to that extent, I think they have achieved that success. Now, in the process, of course, when we come to the collapse of the talks, which Trump announced, frankly, the fact that one American soldier was killed 2 days before the agreement was supposed to be signed, I think was neither here nor there, because just during this year, there have been 16 American soldiers who've been killed while these talks have been going on. between Ambassador Khalilzad and the Taliban in Doha. There have been 9 rounds since October last year, and 16 American soldiers have been killed. So I don't think that was essentially the case. I think it was more to do with the optics that this would take place, the so-called peace deal would take place right when the anniversary of 9/11 was happening 2 days later. And if at that time there had been a major Taliban attack in Afghanistan, then it would have looked politically unsustainable. So somewhere, but at the same time, if you look at the current state of uncertainty in Afghanistan, I think as far as the US is concerned, its options are very simple. I don't think there is any political will to bring in additional forces, so to that extent there can't be more military pressure. Their ability to put pressure on Pakistan is somewhat limited, as I've explained to you earlier, and I think all of you know that very well. So they can either stick around and have these 14,000 fellows there that they have for another year or 2 years or something like that, but that doesn't change the ground reality. Or they can get out by redoing a deal or even without doing a deal. That's as far as the US options are concerned. The Taliban have played their cards well. They've been to Moscow, they've been to Beijing. They've tried to explain that, look, we were ready to do a deal. The terms of the deal were in accordance with what the Americans had worked out. So in that sense, we were not the ones to call off the talks. We were not the ones to call off the deal. That is something that has been done by the Americans. And so in a sense, they're trying to ensure that the international community's support is with them as they now assume their share of power, not through the electoral route, but through a negotiated route with enhanced legitimacy. How this will play out in Afghanistan, I think I'll leave my other co-panelists to dwell on. Thank you.
Thank you, Rakesh, for that. And yes, the myth of the graveyard of empires is so pervasive. Everybody seems to believe it, not really realizing that the creators of modern-day Afghanistan were the British and Amir Abdul Rahman. And the borders of Afghanistan itself, the northern borders, were decided in the Pamir conference between the Russians and the British. There was no Afghan in the room. The borders of Afghanistan were being negotiated. And of course, Afghanistan's winter capital, Peshawar, is in Pakistan now. So, lots of myths, yes, thank you, and yes, developments. Now move to Mr. Rana Banerjee, former Special Secretary, Cabinet Secretariat, to give us his perspective.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks to the ORF. I thought with so many heavyweight experts with field experience in Afghanistan, including the chairman himself and the 2 ambassadors, I'll mainly flag the ground situation aspects which would need to have a perspective for the discussion in the second panel. So this is what I've tried to do, focusing on the subject. To discuss old map of the BBC, it's about 2 years old, but it gives a very good idea of how the Taliban have crept into the rest of Afghanistan and have increased their control incrementally. And it's much stronger perhaps today, but from April, beyond April 2019, even the SIGAR has stopped giving details of the grounds held by the Taliban or the Afghan National Security Forces. So this is, I thought, a better explanation. The darker areas are under full control, the shaded areas are under lesser control of the Taliban in brown. Now, the recent advances, the SIGAR in its 43rd quarterly report given in April, end of April, it talked of enemy-initiated attacks, which you read Taliban, and they increased considerably. The monthly average attacks were up 19%, and from December to February 2019, the ANSF casualties also increased 31% higher during this 3-month period compared to the same period 1 year ago. 2,234 security-related incidents in the last 3 months between December and February, a 39% increase. Now, the Taliban have been repeatedly attacking in an effort to gain control of provincial centers. In Helmand, they wanted to control Lashkargah, Sangin, Musa Kala. They already have control of Garamseyr and Nauzad, and that's in the east, Garamseyr is in the south. So they try to move in a pincer movement towards Lashkargah and Sangin. The response from the government side has been to somehow control the capitals. Similarly, in Kunduz, and the battles have been going on from 2006 right up to now. The first battle of Kunduz in 2015, and the red arrows indicate how the Taliban tried to come from the neighboring or the outlying districts, tried to capture the town, and then resort to hostage attacks or suicide bomb attacks near public installations like hospitals. These are some of the details. For shortage of time, I'll skim through those. Those can be referred to in case details are required. And this was the Ghazni attack last year before the elections. Again, the same sort of tactics coming on from outlying districts into the headquarter capital, trying to hold the capital city of the province, and when attacked by the ANA, then withdraw. So August 2018, then riposte by the ANA, SFIF. Now the nature of the warfare, that is what is important. This is not really conventional war. The tactics of terror, it's a type of hit and run with local modifications where support, out of fear mostly, is available temporarily to whoever is in preponderance or in power. Another feature which the Taliban have used is the use of major highway routes to mount blockages or sieges. Now, this is the highway system, the one in yellow map shows. It's a sort of a ring over the main towns. And this, the one at the left extreme where I have shown a star, and to the Iran border, that's the one India has built, 218 kilometer route from Dilaram, where the star is, to Zaranj on the Iran border. Now this road, while building it, we had a lot of problems, including attacks on our engineers and killing of some of them. But the road is through now. It's a very vital connecting road. But what the Taliban do when they try to attack the towns, they use these highways they set up blockade points, and they firstly counter the government's blockade points and set up their own to extort, whatever movement takes place, normal trade, etc., extortions take place. It's not that the ANA or ANSF are completely powerless. They are a formidable force and they have learned to fight well. The only problem, they have certain problems. Firstly, about the ethnic mix. It is a myth again to say that it is mainly Tajik force. It is now having broadly the same sort of composition, 43% Pashtun, 32% Tajiks, 12% Hazara, 8% Uzbeks. Of course, the officer class may be having more Tajik officers than Pashtuns. But again, people like Amrullah Saleh dispute this observation. They say that no, Pashtun officers have also come up. The equipment is a mix of ex-Soviet and now new American equipment. The training that they get is again a mix of American, French, Australian, Canadian tactics, also Indian. Some of their officers come to Indian academies and then go back and face the fighting front. What is most significant is their recently acquired air power. Today they have about 96 aircrafts and 3 air wings, 4 regional support detachments, and significantly 15 new A-29 Super Tucano aircraft obtained from Brazil, which help in giving them a capacity to move quickly and in command and support operations. So they have been using this quite effectively. But the ANA has massive problems of corruption in leakage of arms, petrol, etc. from the army, desertions of their soldiers, ethnic schisms. Green on blue penetration means they recruit soldiers who turn out to be, ex-Taliban, and they attack their own officers. That sort of green on blue penetration is a severe problem. Now, this is another picture of the same thing which I have said in the previous slide. The yellow is the overall strength, 1,74,000 now. The green shows the gain in recruitment. The red shows the attrition, the desertions, and the killings. The army suffers a high rate of attrition, but they have been able to maintain their overall strength, which is a credit to the Afghan government. What have been the Taliban tactics? It is basically a talk, fight strategy. The known Taliban demands, of course, are release of Guantanamo prisoners, release of all prisoners held inside Afghanistan jails, removal of UN sanctions. Part of these have already been granted. Acceptance of Taliban as a political organization. Now here there is a dispute because they want recognition as an emirate, not as a republic, which is one of the reasons why the last minute accord fell through. They also want a declaration of a time schedule for complete withdrawal of all foreign, especially US forces. They almost got this demand also. The acknowledgement of Sharia, the dilution of the Bonn Constitution to incorporate Sharia provisions in some form. This is yet to be discussed. A comprehensive guarantee for a substantive role for the Taliban in governance after a power sharing agreement. On this, there has not been much progress because they have not agreed to talk to the Afghans in government. An essential corollary which may come up in the whatever peace deal emerges is the purge of existing ANA forces and to accommodate Taliban commanders who have been fighting on the ground and their own armed personnel in some workable, acceptable proportion, like possibly the parallel of the Nepal peace deal can be seen in the recent context. Now, after the failure of the talks process may still resume, as the chairman also said and Rakesh pointed out. The US could go for a no-deal exit. So in that backdrop, the elections become relevant, despite the violence and the threat from the Taliban. Initially, there were 18 candidates, each with a first vice president and second vice president mates, taking the ethnic vote base into consideration. Now only 16 are left. Atmar's nomination has fallen through and Zalmay Rasool has withdrawn. So the Ghani Amrullah ticket is the front runner. And the closest is perhaps his candidate is Dr. Abdullah. Recent latest opinion polls suggest that Ghani has a lead. Because after the collapse of the talks and the perception of, almost US surrender to the Taliban, there is a sympathy for Afghan nationalism, especially in the towns among the educated young Afghan elite. But uncertainties abound in the election. The polling can be very low. The credibility of the result will depend on what is the voter turnout. The voter turnout will be only in towns. Some women have said we will definitely vote. Women in Ghor have given a resolution today that we will definitely vote, whether the Taliban try to kill us or not. But the idea of the interim government of national unity has not entirely lost traction, and it could be revived even after the polls, under pressure from USA. Now, the question then will be just who all can join. Today, former President Karzai has given a statement that we shouldn't have elections, we should have an interim government. And Kanuni and few other old warlords have rallied behind this call. So even after the election, this call may revive. Now, I'd just like to remind the House about the complex ethnic mosaic that Afghanistan is. Here again, these are shades, well-known, different colors. The Hazaras and the Tajiks, along with the Pashtuns, they are spread all over in a very complex mosaic. So this will always have a role to play, and the relevance of ethnic warlords, because none of them really gave up all their arms under the DDR process. So you have different warlords. The Pashtun, again, between the Taliban and the non-Taliban. Well, yeah, you can sort of pick hair split and, but basically the mentality is of warlords. So anyway, I have listed out, this can be objected to. Karzai, Ghani, Atmar, Nabil, these are all the Pashtuns. Stanekzai, Masoom Stanekzai has quit as the chief of the NDS. Gul Agha Sherzai, Rahmatullah is there. Tadin is the brother of Abdul Razik in Kandahar. There are several others. Hikmatyar is his own man, already having some unwritten accords with the Taliban. The Taliban themselves have, various factions. There are the hardliners, Haibatullah Khanzada, Sirajuddin Haqqani. Now, Mullah Baradar, whether he's entirely on board or not, it's not very clear. Amir Muttaqi is there. There are some moderates. Sayyid Tayyab Agha is still hovering. Agha Jan Motasim, he has joined with Karzai recently in the call for an interim government. Then there are some Uzbek Taliban and Tajik Taliban as well, who have been fighting against themselves and against the government. So there are some names there. Then there are the Tajiks, the Hazaras, the Uzbeks, and the Ismailis, all of whom could play a role in the situation that emerges. So some concluding thoughts. The most likely ground scenario currently points to a perpetuation of violence in case of resumption of peace talks, the future Afghan president will have to pave the way for a long and lengthy talks process, possibly have to step down prematurely, as I said. And in the latter scenario, chances of, if the Taliban refuse to talk or talk very reluctantly to the Afghans themselves, then the chances of heightened violence and ethnic tensions are likely. And this will lead to continuing violence, collateral civilian casualties, and unstable status quo in the short term. So I can only reiterate the remarks of John Sopko, the SIGAR Secretary General, who had said some time back that the poor results of Afghanistan stabilization make it tempting to conclude that stabilization should never have been undertaken. However, given the security challenges, we don't have much of a choice. So that is where the situation is. Thank you very much.
While I agree with the broad thrust of this thing, we do have problems when talking ethnicity. Like in the map, Kunduz is a Pashtun province. It's in the north. It's a Pashtun province. Faryab in the northwest, again, very substantial Pashtun population is there. But in these maps drawn, you will find binaries which really don't exist. There's so many areas which are mixed. Ghazni, is it Hazara? Is it Pashtun? It's very substantial Hazara population also. So, one should be I'll be a little hesitant in being very strong on the ethnic angle. And as you know, all the leaders have been in bed with each other, all of them. So it's not that the things politically are always very big. But anyway, moving on. But yes, the thrust of your final points, I think, were very correct. We are in for a long period of uncertainty. In any case, it will be very difficult to graft the Taliban ideas of governance into the existing legal structures. These are not simple solutions. Our next speaker is Brigadier N.K. Bhatia. His experience in Afghanistan, has trained the Afghan army officers in other places, and has others worked with them. Over to you, Brigadier.
Thank you, Chair. If there has been any organization that has faced the maximum number of uncertainties, it is the Afghan army. Over the last about 20 years, it has been through a number of upheavals, both up as well as down. The United States Forces formally ended their combat mission, that is Operation Enduring Freedom, on 1st January 2015 and commenced its new mission, Operation Freedom Sentinel, to start building the new Afghan National Defense Forces or security forces. From its peak of 140,000 coalition troops deployed over 800 sites throughout Afghanistan, which were heavily engaged in combat and tactical level operations, it entered Afghanistan to take on an enemy without a face. One really did not know in which way the operations were going. Facing public backlash and criticism due to increased casualties, it changed its mission in 2015 to disengage from active combat. As of June 2019, 14,000 US military personnel are serving in Afghanistan, 8,475 of whom form the Resolute Support, along with approximately 8,600 personnel from NATO and non-NATO partner nations, bringing the total Resolute Support strength to approximately 17,000, who train, advise, and assist to build a more capable Afghan national security forces. The main aim of the Resolute Support mission is basically counterterrorism and support, train, and advise the Afghan security forces. The coalition forces since 2015 has ceased all operations brigade and below, and now are basically engaged at advising and training Afghan security institutions as well as the core level and GHQ level. So that is, they are not getting involved at the ground level, but are in active support of Afghan National Army and its support units whenever they are taking on the Taliban in its operations. Post 2015, the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces. Now, this also is a misnomer. Though they call it Afghan National Defense and Security Forces, it comprises of the Afghan National Army as well as the police forces. So the complete strength that you read about, as was just projected, is a combination of both army as well as the police force. Now, these unfortunately function under two different ministries. Ministry of Defense, which has got 6 outfits functioning under it, namely the Afghan National Army, Afghan Special Security Force, ASSF, Afghan National Army Territorial Force, Afghan Air Force, Afghan Border Force, and Afghan National Civil Order Force. And then you have 8 different police outfits functioning under the Ministry of Interior. And their name can be as varied as Afghan National Police, Afghan Local Police, Afghan Uniform Police, Public Security Police, Afghan Anti-Crime Police, Afghan Public Protection Force, General Command Police Special Force, Counter Narcotics Police of Afghanistan. So you see a large number of these forces, though existing on ground, are basically working against one another due to huge amount of conflict of interest as well as the corruption levels at the locals. Now, training and refurbishing Afghan National Defense and Security Forces. The new roadmap envisaged long-term objective as an increased capacity by seizing the initiative in fight against insurgency and terrorist operations, professionalizing the Afghan National Defense Forces, modifying force structures to extend security, reducing corruption, and compelling the Taliban to seek reconciliation. Now, actually, they've been able to succeed in their mission is anybody's guess. These factors on ground translated into basically increased combat potential. The effort of the NATO and American forces has been to increase the combat potential of Afghan national forces by pushing them more and more into operational areas and asking them to conduct the operations rather than conducting the operations themselves. As I brought out, there is hardly any operation that the US forces have now carried out except providing the resolute support that is more in the form of air support, artillery support, and intelligence and surveillance resources. One major factor that has added great amount of potential is increasing the size and capability of Afghan Special Security Forces, which I shall be discussing a little later, enabling them to increase their offensive operations, modernizing and expanding the Afghan aviation fleet to provide for a more robust and capable air force by expanding and increasing aviation assets. These were just brought out. By raising Afghan National Army Territorial Forces units designed to provide security in strategic locations. Now, these are basically local people who, once the Afghan army units are able to run over or capture, are held by these territorial forces personnel. Then increasing human resources and leadership development, and institutionalized and merit-based selection of leaders, honest, competent, committed, with unified training system is being endeavored. Reform in human resources and personnel management is also being undertaken, from recruitment to retirement and assigning trained leaders to right positions. However, towards this end, major problems remain due to wide gap in education and other proficiencies. Better integration of resources. With wide array of resources dissipated among MOD and Ministry of Interior, integration has been a major issue in undertaking counter-terrorism operations. Major optimization of existing command and control structures and explore new structures has been the main key area. Another major factor or initiative has been the anti-corruption drive. We really don't know how much this has succeeded, but efforts are on by the NATO and the allied forces to reduce the levels of corruption, illicit activities, and their involvement with undesirable elements. Because as we all know, a good amount of patronage networks function freely in Afghanistan. As already brought out, Afghanistan National Army has about 7 corps, with 111 corps exclusively meant for the security of Kabul. Afghan National Army General Staff is responsible for command and control of Afghan National Army forces. In total, there are 24 brigades, 3 combat air wings, and 24 branches and training schools with additional support facilities. Now, ethnic composition has also been covered in detail, but as per another study, a good number of Afghan soldiers are coming mostly from the Tajik background rather than the Pashtun, and these were supposed to be the main fighters. Though 20 years have passed now, one really doesn't know how many of those remain, but still the intake of the Tajiks is relatively better than the Pashtuns. In spite of its best efforts, the Afghan government has not been able to correct this imbalance, though they may say so otherwise. Another major reason is the tribal loyalties of Afghan Pashtuns and their poor state of education. Now, coming briefly to the Afghan strategy, in support of political initiatives, the military strategy was designed to make Taliban realize that neither they can achieve a military victory, nor can they wear out the Afghan National Defense Forces and the NATO forces. The strategic objective was defined as ensuring 80% of the Afghanistan come under effective control of Afghan state by 2020. Now here also I feel that there has been a failure, because currently the Afghan government may control anywhere between 50 and 55% of the territory, and this figure keeps varying from time to time. At times it's 65, at times it's 55, and with the number of operations that keep going on, the figure also keeps changing. In pursuit of this objective, the strategic focus has been on denying control of important population centers to Taliban, even if that came at the cost of leaving open spaces in remote rural areas. Now, if one would take back their memory to the Afghanistan operations, Soviet Union in the late 80s was controlling all the major urban areas, but they had left their rural areas totally free, thus allowing the Taliban a free run. Though that kind of a situation has still not come, but slowly it is so emerging that the Afghan National Army is unable to defend each and every penny pocket, and therefore they are, I would say, abandoning or leaving thinly held areas and moving to the places from where they can support themselves and defend themselves. Now, Afghan National Defense Forces, supported by the Resolute Support Mission, deployed approximately 3,000 additional troops and A-10 bombers to the Afghan theatre in 2018. That is having some major impact insofar as the operations are concerned. Now, without going into the operational and the tactical capabilities, one major area of achievement for the Afghan National Army has been the Afghan Special Security Forces. The Afghan Special Security Force account for a small portion of Afghan National Security Forces, but has been conducting major operations of the Afghan National Army. The roadmap visualizes doubling of its capacity by adding 33 new commando companies and mobile strike commando companies to the force by the end of 2020, thereby increasing the commando force by 73%. The Special Security Force Growth Plan initiated in 2017 will provide the Afghan security forces the capacity to extend offensive superiority to more Afghan areas. Now, coming to the security, special security forces, just one last point. There is a plan, or it is already being implemented, Afghan National Army Special Operation Corps. You will have all the Afghan Special Security Forces functioning under the Afghan National Army Special Operation Corps, and it is to be further subdivided into 4 Special Operation Brigades and a National Mission Brigade, 10 battalion-sized ANO Commando SOKs, 8 company levels, and 7 support elements, which would be spread across Afghanistan. Now, just a final line. As to what would be the future of Afghan National Army should there be an agreement insofar as Taliban is concerned. The fate of Afghan National Defense Forces will hinge on its financial viability. With NATO having committed to fund the Afghan National Defense Forces until 2024, the Afghan National Defense Forces should be able to sustain itself. However, more importantly, if NATO allies totally decide to withdraw from Afghanistan, the future of technical assets such as aviation resources, intelligence, surveillance, and other resources, logistics, training will be in jeopardy, impacting overall military capability. Additionally, as long as the ordinary soldier continues to receive his monthly pay packet, the fate of Afghan National Security Forces would be secure. Alternatively, expect mass-scale desertions and a beeline of ordinary soldier to the warlords. Thank you.
Thank you, Brig. I think between you and Mr. Rana Banerjee, you brought out the complexities of the Afghan National Army very well. It suffers a very high attrition rate, including desertion. Deaths, more than 30,000 have died. And the enlistment period is very short. Now it has been increased, I think, to 5 years. Earlier, the enlistment period was only 3 years. So at the end of 3 years, the soldier has the option to go back home, period, unless he re-enlists. That is a structural issue also in the Afghan National Army, which has plagued them. But in the overall situation, obviously, that's part of the tensions that they face. Our last speaker for the morning, Maria Habib, the South Asia correspondent in New York Times, who I believe has also reported from Kabul. Over to you.
I lived, yeah, let's change, thanks. Chivalry is not dead. And thank you for inviting me to your manel. All right, so I intend to give you the view of what it's like to live in Afghanistan, because I lived there for 3.5 years, both inside the barracks and outside the barracks, which I think that we're kind of sorely missing the outside the barracks, outside the green line or green zone viewpoint from on this table. So I actually would like to disagree with Rakesh. The Taliban don't really say that it's the graveyard of empires. That's what we say. We non-Afghans say Afghanistan is the graveyard of empires. What the Taliban says is, you have the watches, we have the time. And we have never seen that play out so true and ring so true as we do today. At the end of the day, the US does not want to be there forever, but the Taliban are from there, and they're willing to take however long it takes to get the country back. How many more presidencies, can the US sustain being in Afghanistan? Many polls show that Afghanistan is only on 2% of voters' minds in the US, so why continue to, this is an American view, Trump's view, why continue to expend so much blood and treasure on an issue that just does not register with voters? Another thing I'd like to say is that, when the US invaded after September 11th, Pakistan actually had told them, listen, you have to deal with the Taliban. The Taliban are from there. You're going to have a very ugly civil war on your hands if you don't deal with the Taliban. When I go to Islamabad now, I was just in Islamabad about a week ago. There's lots of smirks on generals' faces, and basically they're saying, we told you. You could have negotiated with the Taliban 18 years ago when you had a stronger hand. Now you guys are begging them to make peace with you. I'm not saying one thing is, I'm not condoning one approach or the other. I'm just simply giving all viewpoints, which is, I guess, what we're supposed to be doing as journalists. So when I first moved to Afghanistan, I immediately went in for a briefing with an American general to understand the lay of the land. And he pointed to the map of Afghanistan, and he said, personally, I blame the British. And he went on to talk about how this country made no sense, and it was carved out of, Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, and, that the Pashtuns should have had their own country that should have actually included much of Pakistan. And basically, this was all to explain the failed experiment that the US was calling Afghanistan at the time. This was 2010. But in reality, the US was making the same mistakes that the British colonialists before them had made and that they were besmirching. The Taliban came into power in the 1990s riding on a wave of popular support, whether it was Tajik or Pashtun. They were supported. That was because the warlords, which I know got him very upset, were making the country hell. They raped and pillaged and just did what warlords do best, which is rob everybody blind. The US then installed those same warlords in the government once the Taliban were ousted. Dostum, who was the long-serving vice president, his favorite thing to do was to take his enemies and tie them up to the tracks of tanks and then drive the tank around, letting his enemies basically disintegrate into smithereens. Mohaqiq, the big Shiite leader of the Hazaras, his favorite way to torture his enemies was to drill screws into their foreheads. So these men were very much warlords. I don't care that we gave them Versace suits and plum government positions. At the end of the day, a warlord is a warlord. But what the US did was that they lined their pockets. They lined their pockets, they gave them those Versace suits, they gave them the vice presidency, they gave them the other cabinet positions that they coveted. But then what the US did was that they complained about all the corruption that was happening in Afghanistan. I had one British intelligence official tell me in 2013, do you know what the problem with this place is? We went to one of the warlords down south to give him a big bag of cash. We found out he was being paid by French intelligence, the Iranians, the Central Intelligence Agency, and the Drug Enforcement Agency of the United States. There was so much money flowing, nobody could account for it, that the major powers were pouring all of their money into one very corrupt warlord, or many warlords, shows the limits of the creativity brought forth to fix Afghanistan for the last 18 years. When I was there, I specialized in investigations revealing massive corruption. American generals oversaw gross misuse of funds. They cannot pin the blame only on their Afghan counterparts. One of my biggest stories revealed how General Caldwell, a 3-star general who was in charge of training all of Afghan forces, oversaw Afghanistan's premier military hospital where Afghan doctors pilfered the medicine and nurses demanded bribes for helping soldiers to the bathrooms, many with their legs blown off because they had stepped on IEDs. Paraplegic war heroes, without the money to bribe these Afghan nurses, defecated in their beds for weeks and then died of simple infections. They underwent major surgeries completely awake without even a Tylenol to ease the pain. Food was being stolen. Wounded soldiers died in hospital beds. Do we blame the Afghan doctors or the American general who covered up the whole thing, hoping to get a promotion and a 4th star? My reporting sparked a congressional investigation that forced Caldwell's retirement and prevented him from getting that 4th star. But the Afghan doctors and the Surgeon General who oversaw the hospital still practice freely. There is some accountability in the US system, unfortunately, not much in the Afghan system. We can talk about what the British should have done, or what the Americans should have done, or what Pakistan should have done. The current overtures to the Taliban, there are a lot of mistakes, but what do we do today? It feels like there's only bad news. Will Afghan women be sold short? From what we understand about the peace agreement that the US nearly signed, there are no provisions on how to ensure groups like women or persecuted minorities like the Hazaras would be kept safe once the US left. Sources there tell me that the reason why the whole peace deal unraveled was because it was a bad deal. because Trump had kept it from everybody. He kept it from General Miller. General Miller's in charge of American forces and NATO forces in Afghanistan. They kept it from Gilani. You cannot keep a peace deal from the Afghan government. You can't keep a peace deal secret from the generals who you've tasked to actually fight the war in Afghanistan. So once that started to be leaked, that's when the peace deal fell apart. And the fact that that President Trump was completely unaware of the optics signing such a deal before September 11th definitely played into it. But at the end of the day, it was a bad deal. The US does not want to be seen running for the exits. They would rather be seen kind of holding their head up high and maybe having a small power walk towards the exit. The whole thing was tasked to Khalilzad, and Khalilzad is there to execute a deal. And at this moment, the deal is how to allow Trump to claim victory as he heads to a re-election in 2020 without looking like this victory is a failure. At the end of the day, they could not sustain that narrative, and that's why the plug was pulled on the peace deal. One of the rare silver linings in Afghanistan is this. One major success, despite all the folly of US and NATO forces, was the buildup of a vibrant civil society that had been demolished after decades of war. Afghans will not go quietly. They will not be sold out to the Taliban. A strong protest culture exists there. Students in Kabul came out on Friday to join climate change protests that were happening around the world. They did so despite the fact that Friday's their day off, and also that unlike in New York, where students can go and maybe smoke a cigarette on the street and have a beer while they're doing their climate protest, in Kabul, if they do that, they risk their lives because the Taliban have actually targeted such protests. The fact that Afghan students came out en masse to protest climate change when their country is in such upheaval speaks volumes about how Afghans will definitely go kicking and screaming if they feel like they're being sold out to the Taliban. And you've seen women there come out onto the streets en masse when they feel like this peace deal that the US is negotiating will sell them short. The Taliban also realizes that there's only so much they can get away with. They see the great development that has happened under US-led forces. Despite the fact that billions was stolen, there was still some development that managed to happen, believe me. So Kabul is a modern city. There are frozen yogurt shops. Girls go to university. There are heavy metal bands that I used to report on when I was there. I mean, it's not just war. There's life. I used to be able to walk to the grocery store. Wasn't able to do that later, but there's life on the streets. The Taliban is just as afraid of taking over the country as they are to continue to fight to get it. They know that once they capture main cities, like Kabul, they will have to explain to their fighters why life under NATO forces isn't the living hell on earth as they've told them it would be. Many of these fighters have been told that women and men fornicate on the streets openly. They say that US runs huge brothels that enslave Afghan women. But what was super interesting to me is that when Taliban fighters actually do get to the big cities, they're pretty shocked. They're fairly shocked that they've been lied to by their commanders, and they're coming from the rural areas mostly. When the Eid ceasefire happened last year, Taliban fighters went into Kunduz city. We spoke about Kunduz city, a few of my co-panelists. We talked about it, in terms of military strategy, how they took it. But what was super interesting was not how they took it, because the Taliban are a very good fighting force. What was super interesting was that once they took it, what did they do? They beelined for ice cream trucks. They wanted to eat ice cream. They had never held an ice cream in their hands. Even the Taliban fighters are eager for development. So how do you continue to maintain this idea that anything the US touches instantly, goes down the drain of immorality, and then also the real hunger by Afghans, whether they're Taliban or not, for modernization? A lot of these Afghan fighters who took Kunduz also then took selfies with locals. It was a really rare moment for peace. The Taliban's mantra has always been, we could have done so much better than the Afghan government. We were shunned globally, and aid was denied to us when we ruled. This government has done nothing but line its pockets. But the reality the Taliban knows is much more complex. How do you maintain a government based on centuries-old Islamic texts that dictate how to govern when people have access to the internet and can easily see how other Arab countries like Egypt or Jordan are run in a very modern way that still respects Islamic tenets? When I lived there, people were less interested in me as an American, but more interested in my Arab lineage and the time I spent living in the Middle East. They were shocked to hear Arab countries do not run like theirs, that women do not cover their hair, that alcohol is available, that men and women mix in many, many Arab countries. Now we have Twitter and YouTube for everyone to do their own research and see parts of Afghanistan are truly behind. Maybe not Kabul, but Zabul is yes. And I think that most Afghans would like their country to look more like Kabul than Zabul. Afghan security forces have their issues, corruption, defection, and they're dying in large numbers. But they are battle-hardened and experienced like few modern armies that exist today. The special forces are doing a pretty good job. Yes, there are civilian casualties. That's a whole other can of worms. And yes, the government's hold on districts is wavering, but a bright line to that is that the number of districts the Taliban has been able to take over the last 2 years has actually fallen quite a bit, dramatically, since 2017. Between the years of 2015 and 2017, they were taking many districts all the time. Now they maybe have a net gain of 1 or 2. So it seems like Afghan forces are holding the line. And they're doing so without much help from the US on the ground. There are US forces there, and French and British, but they largely assist Afghan special forces to kick down doors at night to arrest top militant leaders, or they help train. But NATO is not doing the same village-to-village fighting that they were doing 6 years ago. So when Afghan forces take a district, it's largely because they've taken it. Trump has few foreign policy successes, but he has been able to press Pakistan to bring the Taliban to the table and release Mullah Baradar, which is what ended up kickstarting peace negotiations. Things like the FATF will keep Pakistan in line, is what Western officials believe when it comes to Kashmir. But I think that Afghanistan is going to be a whole different ballgame. And frankly, I don't think the US cares. Pakistan diplomats fear will maintain its militant networks in Afghanistan. At the end of the day, Afghanistan is their only trade route. They can't go towards India, we all know why. And Afghanistan provides Pakistan its lifeline for trade. And at the end of the day, this is a position that's been taken by, we tend to blame General Zia. Like, yes, General Zia was definitely took Pakistan in a very dark turn when it came to supporting Islamic militants. But we forget that actually Pakistani secularists like Benazir Bhutto, was much to blame actually for the rise of the Taliban, because she supported Pakistan trucking mafias to move Pakistani goods west. So how do we get Pakistan to actually play ball when it comes to allowing Afghans to live in peace, a peace where maybe the Taliban do have a power sharing agreement? That still remains to be seen. Thanks.
Just to do, before I open up a Q&A, we started with history and I thought we'll end with history. What was the British aim in Afghanistan? It had one single aim, to stop the Russian advance towards India and the blue waters. Did they succeed? Absolutely. And they succeeded very cheap. It cost them $1 a year of subsidy to Amir Abdul Rahman, and occasionally some guns. The Amir says not good enough, okay, $1.5 lakh rupees. They got it on the cheap. The British were actually very successful in doing what they wanted to do in Afghanistan. And as Rakesh said, Afghanistan after 1870, but for a small incident in 1919, remained at peace throughout. But things have changed a lot. It has become complex and it has become unsafe. I remember last time I walked near Choraya Zambak to buy a SIM card. And the SIM card, the value that I wanted wasn't available. The vendor said, you guard my shop, I'll go and bring it. So he went off. And a passerby told me, you're a foreigner, I can make out. It's not safe for you to be standing on the roads. Now, this would never have happened previously. But obviously now things are quite different there. So who's in control? It's a matter of opinion. It's a matter of chance, actually. And that is what makes things very frightening, that the fact that there's no certainty, there's no certitude in going forward. Now, I objected to Ghani being called a warlord. A warlord requires some armed men under his control and some territory to control. Ghani doesn't even control the ARG properly. So, to call him a warlord is a bit of a...
He was surrounded by warlords.
states.
That's another matter. Two very, very different things. So, Tripathi ji, I'll come to you.
First of all, I'd like to compliment all the panelists for their excellent presentation, covering all aspects of the problem, particularly situation on the ground. I have two questions. The first one, which was two questions. Yeah, relevant question, of course. The first one was briefly touched upon by Ambassador Sood also. My question is whether the action by the West, particularly the United States, to impose its system and values on societies which are not yet ready for them or not evolved enough to adopt that, is one of the major cause of the problem, not only in Afghanistan, but in some other areas also. And my second question is, what is the present status of ISK? This subject was not touched upon. How much area it is controlling? And in case some agreement is reached between Taliban and US and the Afghan government, whether a sizable section of Talibans not happy with the agreement may shift their loyalty to ISK. That's all.
It's your panel, you decide what you want to do, sir. Okay, so my question is to Brigadier Bhatia, and I want to take off from where Maria left off. Now, she has a lot of confidence that Afghanistan will not fold up just like that. There will be pushback from civil society. I am a little skeptical about how much people who come out fighting for climate are actually going to fight the Taliban when they come in and going to actually resist it. And since you have been on the ground, you've worked out there extensively, I wanted to know what your reading of the situation is. Along with that, when we talk about this pushback and, we are hearing stories about how the anti-Taliban forces who are not necessarily part of the state establishment right now, but are regrouping, are trying to ensure that there is some kind of resistance if there is a sellout to the Taliban. Do you think they have the wherewithal to put up a resistance, to put up a fight? Because most of the old so-called warlords are like toothless tigers now. They've been softened by the good life. I don't know how many of them are actually going to be able to put up a fight, but perhaps you could give us some insight onto that.
Following up on what the chair said, the British getting them out, I would recommend everybody see a picture which I saw on Netflix, Charlie Wilson's War. And he was a senator who was given the biggest prize. He gave the Mujahideen Orlikons and Stingers, and they brought down all the Soviet helicopters, and that was the beginning of the end of the Soviets. So something like that. Anyway, my question is 3 words I picked up from the panel. One, you all have talked about leverage. I want to understand, is there any leverage on anybody? In my view, the leverage is only enjoyed by the Taliban, not even Pakistan, which is diminishing. The second word I picked up was extricate. This makes the job of the US forces more and more difficult. From withdrawal, they went to drawdown, then they talked of extricate, which was glee to the Pakistanis and the Taliban. And finally, if you all have talked of a solution, I'm not saying there is an immediate solution, but we fought the insurgency. I'm going to go back to the 50s. That's when I was commissioned. Nagas and the Mizos, we call them insurgents. Now you call everybody a terrorist. Well, we got the leader of the insurgency, Lal Denga, to become the chief minister in Mizoram. And the first 3 governments in Nagaland comprise the underground. So maybe India needs a rethink. Taliban has to be inclusive in the next government. Thank you, Chair.
Putting the Taliban in the government. But yeah, that's in the second session. But frankly, I don't see much of it. Do we have any other... General Mehta.
I would want to know from either Maria or Brigadier Bhatia or even Rana, this question of casualties. if I recall correctly, in one of my conversations recently with the Afghan, I forget whether he was the DA, he was talking about a weekly casualty to a toll of 200. I'm talking 200. And this is in the year 2018.
1,500 to
No. Yeah. So, with that kind of attrition and with the compounded with desertions, how does Rana Banerjee say that that figure of 176 or whatever thousand is maintained? I mean, there seems to be some problem with that. My
We're looking for the chart. That's all.
Yeah. My second question is regards to the control of districts and provincial capitals. As far as I know, not a single provincial capital fell or has fallen except Kunduz for a short while, and a second time, but it didn't fall. Maria, you just said that one district or two districts are probably, they keep shifting control between the Taliban and the government forces. Is that your authoritative figure? Because just one other thing, and my comment is on the cigar report of 2015, which was issued concurrent with the US forces changing its avatar from, I forget the original name, to Resolute Force. They had written and that there will be no strategic collapse. In other words, no provincial capital will fall, and they had certified the capacity, or rather the capability, of the Afghan National Security Forces to hold on. When Kunduz fell, if you will recall, 9 or 10 generals screamed in New York or Washington, and then this, we had this rethink on. But the point I'm making is that the cigar, the Inspector General Sapko or his predecessor, gave a fake report, to use Trump's terminology.
I have one question. I must please permit me 30 seconds of background. After periods of prolonged instability in a country, and Afghanistan has been unstable, I would imagine, starting with the Dawood coup, really. You need a great and decisive leader who can weld the country, hold the country, pull it together. If you look at Afghan history, 1747 there was Ahmad Shah. I think around 1876, after a prolonged period again of instability, there came the Ayn Amir and Amir Abdul Rahman Khan. And I don't think that either of these were very savory leaders. In today's parlance, they would be called warlords. I heard Maria talk about Mohakik and Dostum and their predilections on how to deal with people. On Amir Abdul Rahman Khan, I read that once, I think, a couple was brought to him who were engaged in activities he thought were not justified by Islamic injunction. And he said that they have great passion for each other, so he had them both boiled in boiling water, but that was the king's justice. And of course, times have changed.
The Hazaras he massacred.
Hazaras he massacred, he went into Kafiristan and converted into Nuristan. So I'm not getting into that, but I want to ask the panel, is there any such leader on the horizon in Afghanistan who can really pull it out, get the people together, and get it going again? And the second thing, if I heard Maria correctly, I think she used this term fix Afghanistan. I don't think countries can ever be fixed. National building projects are organic projects. They've got to come from within a country. You can't, this is the entire problem with this conflict resolution and nation building and post-conflict sort of developments as is prescribed in the UN today. That you get in a project and you say this is democracy, these are universal values, and you keep putting in places. And in Afghanistan, we had this queer situation in 2002 when I was there that the Americans were in charge of the security, the army, the Germans were in charge of the police, the Italians, for some reason, justice, and the Brits, anti-narcotics and counter-narcotics. And this is the way you develop countries. And I had a delightful conversation with an American diplomat. And I asked him this, I said, do you do this? So he looked at me rather haughtily and said, well, we have obviously different ways, ideas of nation building.
I just wanted a little elaboration on three aspects. First is this Islamic State of Khorasan province. As per some inputs, that 70% of these people comprise Urkaza and these Afridi groups which are based in, northwestern Afghanistan. And many Afghans believe that it's actually a creation of Pakistan itself, and we should not look too much into it. This is one. Second thing is, I think there is some kind of a bonhomie which has developed between Taliban and non-Pashtun Taliban who are actually in the area of Kunduz and Gorno-Badakhshan area. And a lot of, freedom has been given to these. And also Taliban have been reaching out to General Atta as also to Dostum. But in the meanwhile, I think son of Ahmad Shah Massoud was very recently on record when he said that he is going in Panjshir Valley and he's trying to, rig up some kind of a resistance. And some statements to this, in this direction were also given by Mr. Spanta here, that, well, he said once, if Americans live, they might have defeated Americans, Taliban, but they cannot defeat, another Afghan. So is there anything that is brewing up to counter Taliban in a very efficacious way?
Let's now start.
My point is that, various external powers are involved in Afghanistan, and they all have very different motivations. All are using, I feel that they have been using the Taliban. You have Mullah Akhandzadeh talking with the Americans. Today, Mullah Baradar is in China. He's talking something different. So whether there's these kind of uncertainties will continue, I feel that they will continue. If any example has to be taken, then it should be taken from what President Najibullah tried in the early 90s. Before he was captured and imprisoned, he tried to bring about a reconciliation of all the Afghan people. But then, that attempt was sabotaged. He was imprisoned. Otherwise, there would have been, this point needs to be examined, I feel. How President Najibullah tried to bring about reconciliation with external powers involved. Any kind of reconciliation may be, very temporary, or uncertainties will continue. Thank you.
No, I agree. I don't think that Afghanistan should be fixed by the U.S. I think it's organic. It needs to be organic. But I do think that after you spend about $1 trillion somewhere, you should probably have something to show for it. I think that civil society is definitely something to show for it, because civil society there is strong, no matter what people think. Whether or not students who are protesting in the climate march are going to be the ones to bear arms, that's besides the point. I brought that up to say that people will push back. Whether it will work, I do not know, but people will push back. I know tons of Pashtuns who will push back. Not everybody agrees with the Taliban. And I think what's something that's sorely missing in our outlook on Afghanistan is the fact that the Taliban are about 250,000, maybe, in terms of a fighting force. That was what the last estimate that I heard was. It only takes, and Afghanistan is, 29 million, I think, in terms of a population now. You only need 5% of the population to create civil war and an insurgency. I know, because my country, Lebanon, was in civil war. You don't need, you can create hell and a civil war with not half the country. But at the end of the day, there are a lot of people who do feel like their heart is with the Taliban, or not necessarily with the Taliban, but just not with a very corrupt government in Kabul. So what is the alternative? I don't know exactly what the alternative is. We have tried to have a unified government that has tried to do what Najibullah did. Karzai was named famously as the best dressed man of the year by Tom Ford, the legendary, stylist, because he tried to do that. He tried to unite Uzbeks and Tajiks and Pashtuns. I mean, the way that he dressed was a symbol of that Afghan unity. He wore an Uzbek coat and a Pashtun hat and a Tajik, shirt. And I mean, those are very lame symbolism, but at the end of the day, it's symbolism. And there have been numerous attempts by the central government to try to get everybody, regardless of what their ethnicity is, on the same page. It's not working, and it's not working because, the U.S. was preoccupied in Iraq. They could have maybe tied everything up if they hadn't gone into the Iraq adventure, but you can't just leave the Canadians to take control of. The Canadians were in charge of Kandahar, weren't they? Yeah. So, I mean, you can't just say, see you later, we're going to Iraq, thank you, Canada, for taking over Kandahar, which is the worst province in all of Afghanistan. So that was a huge problem. I'm kind of blanking on what the other questions were. And then the districts. No, I didn't say that. What I meant was that the Taliban's ability to take districts has greatly slowed down. 3 years ago, they were able to take, 2 dozen districts. Now they're taking maybe 1 or 2. In the last 2 years, they've been able to take 1 or 2 districts. And holding, but still, that's a big vote of confidence for Afghan security forces. So we can't deny that.
Bhatia?
Do you want to switch, or you okay?
Yeah, it's okay. Firstly, the state of Afghan army. I would say that post 2015 and after their training by the allied forces, the state has actually improved. They are able to hold on to whatever they are doing. They are able to launch offensive operations, and they have also been taking initiatives to wrest back what has been taken over by the Taliban. Now, this would be amply clear. If you see last year, there were major operations in Ghazni, Faryab, Uruzgan, and again in Ghazni during November 2018 and August 2018. The resolute support called in by the Americans to help the Afghan special forces enabled them to win back these places. Insofar as the rate of desertions and other things go, the problem is that when the Afghan posts, which are in isolated places, they are run over by the Taliban, you see mass desertion, that everybody leaves and just runs away. Nobody wants to die when a kind of an attack is coming from local Taliban, because they are also locals and they would want to save themselves. But the best part is that they remain out of the system and then get back to the system. So that is one very interesting part because in one of the training capsules, I talked to one of the guys and he says, yes, I was serving in the army and then I went away. And he came back after 6 years and rejoined the army. You know, so that is the state of Afghan army and they accept it. And I also asked somebody that don't you have any kind of strict punishments and other things for desertions? He said, no, they are generally very mild. They want to keep up with the strength and they mostly welcome them back. So that is the state of Afghan army. Now, the other question was regarding the militias. In a number of instances, the warlords or the erstwhile warlords have shown their mettle and even led the operations, like Dostam himself going in July and August and helping the forces in Georgia and other such areas. Similar is the state of Ata Noor. Ata Noor took President Karzai so many years to get him off his back. Now that he is back, but he still maintains contact with the local police and his militia is very, very active. And similarly, because of his strength, he is able to garner all the money that is collected from the border trade. So that's how they are surviving. And as far as the sides to whom the militias will go, anybody who pays them the money, they'll go with them. It's as simple as that. And there was one more question. Okay. So
Casualties.
yes, sir. Sir, officially the figures of casualties have stopped coming. The American casualties as on date is approximately 2,800 something. Afghans, they said, were at one time about 200 per month. 800 per month. That figure 200 per week you said is quite right because President himself said in a conference that he's lost 45,000 soldiers. Yeah, but then this figure is not only of the army, this is of the local police as well. So local police, the 8 kinds of police, there are 6 kinds of security forces. So what figures fit in where, one really doesn't know. But the figure is fairly large, no doubt about that.
Yes, the casualties are still around 800 per month. But despite that, this is how the regeneration, this is a figure compiled by an American source. I haven't given it here, but it can be provided to you. And it's a fairly recent, 1 year old or less than a year old.
It's a dynamic figure, as you can see.
Regarding Sanjeev's question about IS Khorasan, basically they had some control in Achin district of Nangarhar, which is adjacent to Pakistan. So there are 2 groups of TTP Khorasan, which are comprised mainly of Pakistani elements, the Fazlullah group and the Khan Saeed Sajna group. The earlier group, Fazlullah, before his killing by a US drone operation, they were hostile to the Pakistan army. The Khan Saeed Sajna group, the army and the ISI of Pakistan seem to have developed some contacts with them and they are able to be or are perceived to be controllable. But the Taliban who are fighting in Afghanistan, some of the field commanders have been in clashes with the TTP Khorasan. So it's an evolving relationship. There can be deals between them, but as of now, there are in hostile equation and fighting over control. The Afghan army also is unable to reach some of the small pockets that are in control of the TTP Khorasan. As such, there is no ISIS of Arab or Chechen or Uzbek content present in Afghanistan, and this is borne out by figures inside the government. So that is one question that you had asked. Regarding anti-Taliban forces regrouping, the militias are there. There are militias of local field commanders opposed to the Taliban. Some old village elders in small districts who have opposed the operations of the Taliban and sided with the Afghan national forces and the US and the British operations, for instance, in Helmand. But this is old now. Some of the older Taliban, the anti-Taliban militia commanders have passed away or have got killed. But the fighting is still going on. Intense fighting is going on in parts of Faryab, Herat, Farah, Ghazni, Ghor. All these areas, there are local fights going on between field commanders of the Taliban against local militias supported by ANSF. That is still going on intensely now every day. So this is an evolving situation, and as I said, the ANSF has been able to hold their own, but by and large their strategy has been to try to control the district or the provincial centers. Outlying districts, they don't worry so much if the Taliban are able to control. Outlying districts of provinces, they leave it to the Taliban. So that is the broad trend that is there. And I think Maria is right that in recent last 1 year or 1.5 years, the overall control of districts by the Taliban has not increased by leaps and bounds. But the perception still is that they are in the rural areas fairly strong. But they haven't been able to hold on to any district or provincial centers. Areas, no, there were one or two other questions about, the general asked about the Taliban flirtation with Uzbek and Tajik commanders. That is there. Qari Hikmat was having large areas in Jawzjan and Faryab, but Qari Hikmat was killed again with the help of, faction fighting. There is, his successor is there, but they are fighting with Taliban field commanders who are encroaching from south of Faryab, and they are going into the Uzbek areas held by the previous Qari Hikmat's people. Similarly, in Tajik areas in Badakhshan, there is a fight between two pro-Taliban faction commanders. Vivek's question about charismatic, possibilities. I mean, Ahmad Shah Massoud's son is being talked about slowly, but he is still very young and still very inexperienced. The Tajik, personalities are not very keen about backing him as yet, meaning the Massoud brothers.
The next panel is getting ready now.
Okay. So I'll wind up. And the other is, of course, Amrullah Saleh, if he is a vice president candidate with Ghani. And Ghani is pretty old and he's been sick in the past. But again, Bacha Sakau is the only Tajik leader who could control Afghanistan for a little while. He was assassinated. 1 week. So it has to be a Pashtun leader. Who will be that Pashtun charismatic leader? I don't see one.
Thank you. I think part of the problem is that there is, while all Afghans want peace in their country, there is no national consensus on the terms of reconciliation, because the peace is being driven by external actors, whether the Americans or the Russians or whoever else. So basically, and that's because there is a sense of fatigue that has come in. And so people want to exit. And yes, they don't want to be, the US, for all the fact that after winning World War II, actually, if you think about it, the Korean War resulted in an armistice. Vietnam resulted in another ignominious kind of an exit. The Americans withdrew from Lebanon after the bombing of the barracks in the early 1980s, withdrew from Somalia after Black Hawk Down in the 1990s, withdrew from Iraq in 2011, came back in 2014 when the IS came on the scene. No. So, and they withdrew from Afghanistan. The CIA, they were not actively there, but they withdrew from Afghanistan 89, 90, once the Soviets were thrown out. And then they came back in 2001, and now they are keen to exit once again. So it's not been a particularly great record of interventions or nation building or whatever it is people may want to call it. And I think the best way what was said was by actually an American soldier who said, well, we've not been in Afghanistan for 18 years. We've been in Afghanistan for 1 year, 18 times. And I think that kind of explains part of the problem. And I think the attrition is that if you look at the overall strength of the security forces, which was estimated at 352,000, that was this figure. This is counting both the security, police, army, etc., etc. Currently, it is down to about 272 because of attritions, desertions, lack of proper recruitment, etc., etc. So, if you look at what are the figures required to maintain an effective counterinsurgency force. The fact is that Taliban is no longer described as a counterinsurgency. So we don't know who is fighting whom. It's just that the Taliban are negotiating. But unlike other negotiations, they have engaged in this negotiation without declaring a ceasefire. So even as they negotiate, they continue to improve their ground position. And I think that's one of the great difficulties. Thank you.
Wait, but you know, the IRA, they continued to bomb right until they signed on the dotted line a peace deal. This is what insurgencies do. They fight until a peace deal is actually signed. And the big thing is can a peace deal can happen, but the thing is that it has to go, it cannot happen under a US president that is simply looking for a headline before the 2020 elections. Because what that peace deal included was a complete sellout of the Afghan people, to the point where even his generals, General Miller, who heads NATO forces in Afghanistan, were completely appalled. And they were left in the dark the entire time until they were informed by people who, like Bolton, who thought that the whole thing was madness.
The uncertainty continues. Had the deal been signed, 23rd of September, yesterday, the Taliban and the Afghan government were supposed to meet face-to-face in Oslo for discussions. Always ifs and buts. So planning is not always. It is a very complex situation. The Taliban, the non-Taliban, the militias. The militias don't fight. They extort money. No militia fights. Even the Taliban, if you actually see, do not actually come to emerge as a fighting force on a regular infantry basis. They do not fight head-on. Things are obviously complex because they're operating inside civilian areas. It's very difficult for an armed unit like the US Army or the Afghan security forces to handle somebody who's shooting at you from behind screens, So obviously civilian casualties comes in, so many things comes in. So the battle is not a battle that generals are used to. There are battles that the insurgents and the Nagas and the Mizos showed us that's the way they fight battles. And therefore, obviously your battlefield tactics have to be very different, which is why things continue to be what it is. But yes, no outsider can ever fix Afghanistan except, and I'll end on that big except, even if all the Afghans agree to a peace deal, if a certain neighbor of theirs is determined to cause unrest in that country, it will be very difficult to actually enable peace in Afghanistan. You need somebody to rein in Afghanistan's massive neighbor to its east. With that, ladies and gentlemen, let's thank our four panelists for taking us through.